If you coach with a fear mentality, you will get results. They won't last, but you will get results. If you run your business like a sweatshop, you will get results, you will get profits, but all your people will leave. Maybe I should have shut up for a second and gone back and looked at the drawings. That was the window mentality, that you're not looking out. And if I'm out there pointing fingers, they're going to turn around and point fingers. That's a me problem. I realized that this fell on you. I put you in a bad situation and it's not going to happen again. You got to read people, and not everybody's motivated by the same things. I was not a reproductive leader. I didn't create that next generation. You look at Coach K, that's a reproductive leader. It's either adapt or die. Chase leadership. The money will come. There's eyes on you all the time.
I want to welcome everyone to another episode of the Impactful Leader Podcast. Today's conversation is one I've been looking forward to because it represents something I deeply respect in leadership, and that's evolution. So our guest today started his career doing the technical work, drawing the plan, solving the problems, and mastering the craft. But over time, he transitioned from being the engineer in the room to becoming the leader of engineers. Steven Daley is the president of Optima Engineering, one of the largest regionally based MEP consulting firms in the Carolinas. Under his leadership, the company has expanded its cultural vision, strengthened its ownership structure through the ESOP model, and leaned deeply into coaching, retention, and developing the next generation of leaders. But what stands out most to me about Steven isn't just growth. It's practicing humility. It's emotional intelligence. It's the willingness to soften, to evolve, to admit mistakes, and to make the people around him win. So today we're going to talk about ego, culture, coaching, ownership, leadership under pressure, and what it really means to move from personal success to shared success. So Steven, I want to welcome you to the Impactful Leader Podcast.
Man, that was a great intro. Thank you so much. That's really well said.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. So when you first joined Optima in the late 90s, you said you told your bosses you wanted to sit in the corner office someday. So what gave you that clarity?
I've always been, somebody that's not afraid to, say what's on my mind and wear my heart on my sleeve. And that's just how I felt. I was, starting with a small company, and I didn't know that, 30 years later, we were going to be as big as we are, or we were going to be, the physical, the regional leader that we are. I just kind of thought this is just something that I can do and something that, I can be passionate about. And, I've always felt that I've had, a bit of that it quality. And maybe that was my ego at the time, that I thought that I could be the guy that could do this, that could succeed those guys and, drive their firm and develop their firm into the next generation of its existence.
So let's stay in that vein. So back in the 90s, what did young Steven get right?
Young Steven got lucky, I'm going to say, because this wasn't the age of the internet. This was, the late 90s. I'm in the computer lab at Ohio University my senior year on a website called bigyellow.com. And I'm searching engineering in Charlotte, and it's pulling up, 10 company names. And I'm writing blind letters to these people and saying, I've never been to Charlotte other than for a summer. My parents moved down there. I want to start a career down there. And, just one of the companies that I happened to find was Optima Engineering. And normally I would send those letters out on Friday. Then I would call all the people that I sent the letters to, like the Wednesday or Thursday of next week. And sometimes it went somewhere and sometimes it didn't. You never knew who was looking. It's not like you had the want ads or the classifieds. So it was just kind of one of those serendipitous things that the owner of this company called me. They had just, parted ways with somebody, and, they were looking for a young engineer to come in and take his place. And we had a good talk, and, we set up an interview. And when I graduated and came down, I came in and met with them, and it just felt right. I interviewed with 3 or 4 firms down here, and, being a Northern guy or a Midwestern guy coming to the South, I kind of stuck out. I was louder. I was more brash. The Southern hospitality wasn't really my cup of tea yet. But again, like you say, you soften, you learn to adapt, and you learn that, it's just a culture that you can be comfortable in. But, it took off pretty quick. I got, they were surprised at, how fast I kind of adapted to things and jumped into things and what I wasn't afraid to do. And it clicked. And, even from the very start, it was good. But again, it was just on a whim that I found them. It happened to be the right time. And, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to luck, that you find the right situation, that you find the right fit for who you are and where you are in life. And I mean, if those guys were already in their 60s, it probably would have been too early for me. Or if those guys were in their early 30s, maybe it wouldn't have lined up this way, but it just happened to be that they were about a half generation ahead of me. And it just all kind of fell into place.
That's amazing. So let me ask you this. So you and I both know as a leader, the journey of learning is filled with great moments and they're filled with low moments. And a lot of the learning can actually come through failure.
Sure.
So when you think back to those early years, give us an example of a moment where you got it wrong, but you learned from it.
Sure. One of the things they loved about me is I was fast. If you gave me a project to do, a sheet of markups or whatever, I would knock that thing out, man. I would just, get right through it and go and get on to the next thing. And when you're that way, sometimes you get ahead of yourself. Like I remember a time that I took a project and I was like, I don't need to go to the boss and have him show me what to do. I'm just going to do it and show it to him. And I did. And he was like, this is all wrong. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have done that. And I had to erase the whole thing and redo it. But he was right. I mean, I just kind of got it and thought, okay, well, then I'm just going to do side to side and kind of go with it. My favorite example of that is, back to the speed thing. I used to draw markups. That used to be the way it was, is a senior engineer would draw what was called a red line on a drawing page and hand it to you, and you would put it in AutoCAD. And I sat there and I highlighted all the stuff as I went and I drew it and I got it done real fast and I brought it back to him, and they'd check through it and kind of come back. And he had told me a couple of times, you need to be a little bit more detail oriented, go back over your work and, do that. And at this point, there had been a couple of those nudges and it was time that he was fed up with it. So he came in, closed my door, and he read me the Riot Act. But it was exactly what I needed. It wasn't oh God, I'm going to crawl back into a corner. It was, I can be better. I'll show that son of a bitch. And, it worked from there. So, but he knew that about my personality. And that taught me, I mean, there were other guys that were working for us at the time. If you did that, they would probably quit. But he knew that type of motivation would push me in the right direction, that I would take the direction and get better from it. And it taught me that you got to read people, and not everybody's motivated by the same things and not everybody absorbs in the same way.
Right.
But he knew that would work with me, and it did.
That's awesome. So at what point did you realize leadership wasn't about being the smartest engineer in the room?
That was a process too, because I think it was important to me early in my career to show that I was that guy, to even stretch into things I didn't necessarily know enough about to claim that I did. Just the need to be right, the need to be, that guy. But yeah, I guess it's that coming of age thing that you kind of soften up a little bit. You see the consequences of your mistakes sometimes. You're out in the field and, something doesn't look right and you're like, no, you need to do this, this, and this. Well, are you sure your details say that? No, I'm pretty sure it's that. So they do what you said, and then that's wrong. And then, the senior engineers come out and they're like, well, I don't know why you did that. Well, your guy told me to. Well, maybe I should have shut up for a second and gone back and looked at the drawings and not, again, been in a hurry to get to a solution, take the time to find the right way. Or, ask the right questions, go back to the office and say, hey, well, what have you seen? As we've grown as a company, we've got just such a world of experience. And I always tell my young guys, if you're comfortable with this guy, talk to him. If you're comfortable with this guy, talk to him. Or, even now there's times that something comes up, a challenge in one of our projects or something, that there's a group of 10 or so of us mechanical engineers that we just send it out. Has anybody seen this? Has anybody encountered this at some point? And I don't think there's ever been a time that nobody said, yeah, this happened 10 years ago and this is what we did to resolve it. And it worked. Or, we can put our heads together. Because that group of 10 guys probably has a collective 250 years experience doing what we do. And you got to tap into that. You got to, take from all those different surroundings. The 10-man company I started with, I didn't have 15 guys that I could go to for advice, or, now we do. And we should take advantage of that.
And I remember from a previous conversation, Steven, that you made a comment about how important it is to show up and how you had to go through a journey and ask yourself, like, I need to change how I show up.
Sure.
You made that statement. So, and then you said something about looking in the mirror instead of the window. So what does that mean practically? And why is it important to learn how to show up? And what does it mean for you to show up now, even as the president?
No, it's a very good point. The being there, showing that you care, all that kind of stuff. I remember I was at a conference not too long ago. I think it was the head of NASA at the time, or somebody that took over the head of NASA after they had some catastrophic failures. And, a very smart guy that was also at the conference, asked him the question, what do you do to rebuild confidence? What do you do to kind of do this? And you said, you're there. You don't deflect. You don't shy away. You go and you fix it. When we have mistakes in our projects, it happens. You go and you find that solution. You don't look for what happened or how come that's an after thing. Let's get it back on track. Let's get it going and then try to figure out how we could do better. And, as I've kind of, stepped up the ladder in a leadership realm, things that happen below me, but that's not my problem. That was his fault. And that was the window mentality that you're not looking out. You got to look in. And I learned so much more about, what could I have done better, or how could I have put him in a better situation to be able to handle this project or address this problem or whatever it was going to be? How can I, change what I'm doing to affect the outcome more than, well, you should have done this, you should have done that. The theory of the window and the mirror can be a very powerful one in once you realize kind of how what you do, those people look up to me. Those people, look to me to see what they're supposed to be doing. And if I'm out there pointing fingers, they're going to turn around and point fingers. But if I'm out there saying, hey, I could have done this better, how can we work better as a team? That's the attitude that they'll turn around and connect with their people, with their colleagues.
Yeah. So, man, what did you do to develop that skill of introspection? Like, after even talking to you, I think you and I have shared maybe 2 hours of conversation so far together. I see that you're a man who really thinks deeply about your leadership, about your people, about how you build teams. So if I'm someone who is a high performer, but I'm just like a bulldozer and I've never really take the time, what advice would you give me to that business owner out there that lives that way? Like, they're just bulldozing, they're getting the return on investment, but there's a blood trail behind them. What advice would you give that leader?
That it's kind of like I'll relate this back to coaching, that if you coach with a fear mentality, you will get results. They won't last, but you will get results. If you run your business like a sweatshop, you will get results, you will get profits, but all your people will leave. If you have that bulldozer mentality and you just go after everything that you possibly see in your way and you run over, any of, those obstacles that, may or may not be something that you need in the future, it's going to catch up to you. It's going to backfire on you at some point, or you're going to burn yourself out. That's not a sustainable way to go. The Bobby Knight coaching theory doesn't work anymore. There was a time that crack the whip military style was, but again, that worked in college. You have kids for 3 or 4 years, maybe 2 years, when they're actually playing. If that was anything else no, it just doesn't work that way. You've got to develop, you've got to, lead with a different attitude than that, or you're going to drive yourself crazy. You're going to drive your people crazy. The advice I would say is just, hey, take a step back, slow down a little bit. The same as, the guy that came in and read me the Riot Act, it worked with me. How do you get that guy's attention and say, hey, you got to be careful kind of how you're treating this. You're going to need something from that guy someday, or you're going to need, to grow a network, to grow those tree branches and not just have a straight line going up. That tree is going to fall down. It's going to die, but the one that, branches out and spreads itself out is going to flourish.
Yeah, that's so good. And what I believe about leadership is that you can't really be the best leader you can be without leaning in relationally.
Sure.
But in my experience with a lot of high performers, they can be visionaries, they can be doers. And sometimes it can just be a struggle to embrace relationships, or they struggle relationships. So how do you coach high performers who are not quite aligned with relationships?
I guess engineers aren't really known for having that soft skill, right? It's a different mentality. It's a different way of going about things. And you're absolutely right that, we, especially as a young company, we promoted the best engineers to be project managers. And some of them were organized and could handle, all the relationship issues with that you're working with other disciplines and your point of contact with the client. And some didn't do that very well. They were very good at, doing their stuff, staying in their lane and doing their thing. You give them more, it would overwhelm them. And then we saw, all right, well, some of these guys can be organized, can communicate well, can kind of get things going. Maybe you'd be a good personnel manager. And sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't, because you're right, that soft skill might be there. It might not. Another anecdote is another of the lucky Steve things is, that's kind of the journey that I took, that I went from, learning under somebody to designing my own projects. It was the early 2000s, I believe. And we had a client up in Winston-Salem that was doing a bunch of branch banks up and down the East Coast. Now, branch banks have kind of made a comeback, but there was a time that you didn't see a branch bank get built forever once online banking became a big thing. But yeah, we designed probably 250 BB&T banks up and down the East Coast. And they just said, here, manage this client, try and make this work. And I was not good at it at first. I was very abrasive and that deadline's not going to work, or we're not going to be able to do this. But, that kind of working with their people and working with our people, it was something that I was able to grow through. And they were small projects. They weren't complicated, but the things that you do in Florida aren't the things that you do in Maryland. And you've got this, zoning jurisdiction in DC that you've got to deal with. And you've got this, this one's out on the beach and you got to design that a little bit differently. And, just learning through that and, connecting with those clients on, how we can, make these projects work together, that it was just at the perfect time in my career for me to figure that out. And then as I, kind of ascended into, doing more of the larger projects and managing the larger clients, I had that experience to rely on. And we've talked about that too, with some of our leaders, that, we all learned on small projects. We all developed even managing and client managing on small projects. My firm doesn't do a lot of small projects anymore. So how do we teach our young guys when they're only dealing with these big projects? How do we develop them the same way we were developed if we don't have that quicker transition of, hey, this is your project, now take it over? To trying to refresh our mentality to, what this version of us is. So, but again, it took time. It took reflection. You're right. It took, that went wrong and it was my fault and I should have done this, and picking up the phone and saying, hey, I screwed that up. The mirror, right? The mirror, not the window. I could have done better with this. I could have handled this situation better, and I will in the future. And people they appreciate the fact that you're willing to admit that and you're willing to grow. They want to grow with you. They want to succeed. They want their projects to succeed, and you're part of that. So, yeah, it's a powerful move when it happens.
Yeah, I love that you're not trying to attempt to be the infallible leader, because some people have that philosophy to where I can't let them see me, blush or bleed. I have to be perfect, but what that does in my experience is that it fosters a culture of trust. Whenever the leader could say, man, that was a bad idea. I really dropped the ball on that. Or even, sure. And even more, going to seek counsel within the team who may have knowledge that you don't have about something. So that level of vulnerability is so important. So I'm thinking about one thing that you said in our previous call as well. You said over the last 3 to 4 years, you're mostly coaching. Mm-hmm. So what changed? What did that transition look like from 4 years ago to now?
Very good question. And again, let's go with another Steve got lucky in this scenario, that I had a son and he wanted to play baseball. Baseball was my sport. And, we got him involved as a 5 or a 6-year-old, in T-ball or coach pitch or whatever that might have been. And I got involved with coaching and I was good at it. I was organized. My project management days taught me that I could plan a practice on a spreadsheet, and it was baseball and basketball at the same time. And I remember an assistant coach of basketball that I worked with the first time. He was just like blown away by, I had it down to, this is the first 15 minutes. This is what we do. Then we break apart and we do this. But man, we made the most efficient use of the hour we had in the gym, or the hour and a half that we had on the field. And it just I had fun with it. I was lucky that I had a good group of parents, that I never really had major conflicts with those kind of folks. But doing the rec coaching led into travel baseball, and I coached travel baseball forever. And then middle school and high school baseball eventually, as Vince grew up and kind of went with it. And having all of that experience of guiding young men, of guiding parents, of being, that voice that they look up to, or that leader by, not just by what you say, you got to do it. And, as, that became more evident in my engineering career as, we developed and had that, bench strength, or sorry, I shouldn't say bench. Bullpen is the way to go. I learned that in a seminar not too long ago too, or from one of those books that I read that, as I got further into leadership, I realized how little I knew. So I did that for a long time. I read a bunch of books about, how can I be better with this, or what successes have other people had. Mm-hmm. But that coaching experience is really what I drew on when it came to the point that, I had so much going on that I couldn't really engineer anymore, that I just had to, lead people and lead projects and lead the firm to the next place. Because I could keep getting projects done. I could keep banging things out, but, we're not going to develop as a firm. We're not going to develop that next round of project managers, that next round of personnel managers, if I won't get out of the way. Right. So, focus on the big picture, focus on this and that, but at that point it was just, and you'd be surprised that what you find out when you become the head of an office or, the president of a company as it stands right now, the things that people are going through behind the scenes that you never knew about, that you become privy to when now you're the big guy, you're the boss. And, just the lessons you learn from coaching and the lessons you learn from being in that situation and helping people, as they go through struggles that, some that you've seen and some that you haven't, but just showing that you're there, showing that you're willing to show up, that you're willing to help them through it. And, I'm willing to change what I'm doing to make it a better outcome for them. Maybe that was too big of a project or too big of a bite of the apple for that, particular colleague to take at that time. That's a me problem. And I come to them and say, look, I realize this went poorly, but this was my fault. That was the mirror. Yeah. That I realized that this fell on you. I put you in a bad situation and it's not going to happen again. Let's find a way to get through this and find a way to grow from it. But that's what coaching was. You strike out in the big moment, and do you come back and do you just go in the corner of the dugout and say, I never want to play again? Or do you say, hey, I can't wait for my next chance to grow from that moment and go? Right. And how do you react to it? I think we had this conversation once upon a time that I remember when my son was very young. He struck out or grounded out or something, and he was mad, and he's walking back to the dugout and he slammed his helmet down. And I kind of got after him like, that's not how we act. That's not how we do. Is it? Why'd you do that? Well, Dad, that's what you do. Because I was playing fast pitch softball at the time. And I'd probably done that. But my point was, hey, I bought my helmet and I can buy another one. You can't. But I realized that, there's eyes on you all the time. There's people that are watching and, that are watching to see how they're supposed to react to things, whether it's kids or whether it's colleagues or, young people, they don't know. And, you've got to be, when you're in a position like this, you've got to be that guy that is going to show the right way. And if you don't, and I haven't, I've made those mistakes, you got to admit it. I'll go on to my town hall, every quarter that I give to the company, and I'll tell them all the things I did wrong. And that's okay. And I'll show my vulnerability. And that wasn't a 30-year-old Steve thing to do. It's a 50-year-old Steve thing to do. But I think people connect with you so much more when they see that you're not that infallible leader. You're not that, hey, it's going to be this way or the highway. I mean, you see so many politicians that just direct that way, and you're just scratching your head going, why? Yeah. If you would just be one of us, it would be such a better process.
Yeah. And Steve, I want to rewind. There's something that you said that really stuck with me just now. You said a lot of good things, but I'm going to just highlight this one piece. It seems like you have such an awareness of the whole person. And what I mean by that is that some leaders expect their people to show up and leave your problems in your car, almost as if I don't care what you're going through in your personal life. When you're here, there's one job that you need to execute. But based on what you said, it's like, no, that's not the philosophy. Yes, you do have a job and responsibility, but you recognize that, no, what's going on at home can impact the work. And what it sounds like, Steve, is that you are a leader who actually cares.
I try to be. And we went through a cultural shift when I took over as the head of the Charlotte office, where, we had always been a very outward facing, do whatever the client asks. Let's make sure that, we get whatever done, whatever, however, come hell or high water, we're going to make this happen. And, we were very successful with that type of a philosophy, but, we were looking at our growth plans and we were looking at our attrition rate. And I said, we're never going to be able to hire, 15 people to grow by 7 and replace 8. That if we don't turn that dial inward and be more focused on our colleagues, we're never going to have the people to get the work done that these clients are expecting anyway. So, it was an internal shift, and it kind of had to fight the bear sometimes with some of my older colleagues that I'm working with that have always done things the same way and didn't want to, let the young guys work from home every now and then, or, be a lot more flexible with privileges that we had to earn. We have to kind of offer to that next generation of workforce because, it's just not the same mentality. They don't have the same corporate ladder drive that us Gen Xers had. It's more of a net that they want to kind of see what this is about and see what that's about. But it's either adapt or die. We're either going to be 15 old guys that close the doors one day, or we can adapt to what this generation needs. And you're right. We spend about 40 or 45 hours a week together. That's 8 hours a day. There's 16 more that each one of these people has. Maybe they're sleeping for 6 to 8, but still, there's still 8 hours that, they've got a family. They've got things that are going on. The eye-opening part of that for me is probably when I went through my divorce in 2017. And, work I leaned on being here because it was dependable. I knew, and living in a studio apartment, as a grown man was a little bit too, but, there's always going to be things that are going on. And if you deal with that with compassion and not, hey, you should have been here, you should have done that.
Yeah.
That guy's going to come back to back for you when chips are down with somebody else or another situation. Hey, they took care of me. Let me work to take care of this guy, or let me, give a little bit more when I have it to give. And that mentality really shows through.
Yeah. So now I want to shift the conversation to talking more about culture. And you alluded to it, there was a lot of older guys working with you, and your policies at one point just weren't popular. Right. You got some pushback. There was some tension. So one of those things had to do with, as you mentioned, work-life balance.
Absolutely.
So why is work-life balance a competitive advantage now?
I think it has a lot to do with generational things and kind of what I talked about my boss, ripping me a new one and me reacting well to it. I mean, our generation would never gone to psychiatrists. Our generation would never talk about mental health issues or, anxiety or depression or any of those things. And I thank The Sopranos, the HBO TV show, for kind of normalizing that strong, albeit gangsters, but strong people need to talk things out. They need to be able to have those things. And, the world that I grew up in the 1980s is very different than the world my son grew up in. We didn't have social media. We didn't have cameras and video, chasing us around everywhere we went, thank God, or, some of my college exploits would have probably sunk my career, but it's just a different world. And, their fears are so much different than ours were. But their parents didn't tell them to suck it up and go. Their parents spent more time, and, the whole Gen X, come home when the street lights come on. And, right. That's kind of the way it was. And we didn't parent that way. And, the kind of the generation in between that developed, the millennials, didn't really parent that way either. And you just got to take a much bigger look at the whole person. And if you don't care about them, they're going to see this as a job. And I don't want this to be a job. I want this to be a career for our people that we're investing this time in, that we're, trying to make them better, trying to show them their career path and keep them on their career path. But that's how you grow. That's how you make a sustainable, corporation that way. And it's the difference between there's a book that talks about the stages or the levels of leadership, being a productive leader and being a reproductive leader. Right. I'll make an example of when I coached high school baseball. I took a program that didn't win a game the year before I took it over. And I had mostly freshmen, maybe a couple of we were bad. I mean, I barely would put a kid at third base that I was afraid he was going to get killed every game. So sometimes I played with 4 outfielders and only played with 3 infielders. And other coaches would look at me like I was crazy, but it was my best way of doing things. But I built that team as those kids grew into a competitive baseball team. I mean, they won the conference my son's senior year, and I was going to retire after that, and that was going to be that. And they brought in another coach, and I had a good young team my senior year. I think I started 5 freshmen. A year later, 3 of them were gone, and the program was back to being a push shoulder. I was not a reproductive leader. I didn't create that next generation. You look at Coach K. Coach K retires from Duke. In comes John Shire, and they didn't miss a step. That's a reproductive leader. That's somebody that cared enough to make sure that was going to be a good situation when he left. And it's not like I didn't care about that situation at the high school, but I didn't do enough to make sure that was going to happen. And, you never know what's going to happen in life. I don't know that, in a month from now, I'm still going to be here. So if I don't create that next generation behind me, then what have I done other than, showed up in a nice suit coat a couple of times and kissed babies and shook hands? That's not who I want to be. I want to be, somebody that people say 50 years from now, boy, it was great that we had a chance to know Steve, that we had a chance to, kind of grow under him, and that he took the time to, invest in us and find things maybe that we didn't even know we had.
Yeah. Leadership and legacy go hand in hand.
Sure.
Because, our time as leaders is really short. Life is short, but the question is, what are we leaving behind? And that's why I love how you differentiate it, I guess, between just being a manager and being a coach. When I think about a coach, Steve, I think about someone who minimizes the weaknesses and highlights the strengths.
Right.
There's a reason why on a basketball team or a baseball team, there are different positions, and one person may not be a fit for another position, but they're fit for where they are. And it takes a leader to be able to see that. So as we model, as you're modeling and as you're calling out the best in people, that type of legacy never goes away. Because even though people may not remember your name, like I honestly don't care, Steve, whether people remember my name, but the values and the wisdom, I want to pass that down. I want my great, great, great grandchildren to benefit from the wisdom and my experiences, even if they don't remember my name.
Well said.
So,
well said.
I appreciate that. Man, this is such a rich conversation. Man, where do we want to go from here? Steve, you brought up so many. I feel like we need to do a part 2. But one thing that I noticed you talked about was being, and of course, this is implicit. This is how I'm interpreting.
Sure.
But to be culturally astute, like to know when the times are changing and how to pivot with it.
Sure.
So what happens when people are not willing to pivot with the times? What if I'll play the devil's advocate, because I agree with you, but imagine I didn't agree with you and I'm in my 70s and I'm like, man, that's Steven. He's producing soft workers. They're just soft.
And I hear that. And I've had longtime colleagues leave the company because of policies that I've instituted.
Yeah.
But am I going to lose one of them, or am I going to lose 8 of my young guys that are looking for more of a nurturing atmosphere, that are looking for more of somebody that cares about, what happens outside the 4 walls of this office?
Yeah.
And, the young guys, my dad's generation, my dad was with General Tire for his entire career. And growing up, I thought that's just what you did, is you got a job and that's who you stayed with. This younger generation is not that way. Even the social media guys that do, their reels or whatever they're going to call it and say, hey, you got to jump to get ahead. I never jumped. I waited my turn and I got ahead just fine.
Yeah.
One thing that stuck with me, Colin Cowherd he's a radio sports.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's kind of he was talking about the way his career went when he went from, being I think he was a minor league baseball announcer, and then he got with ESPN and finally got a show. Long story short, he said something that stuck with me, that chase leadership. If you can get a $10,000 raise somewhere, yeah, that's great, but they may expect things of you that you just can't do. If the economy turns, who's the first person they're going to get rid of? Is the expensive, new guy that we just got in here. Right. If you feel like you're being mentored, like you're being led, that's exactly where you should be. Now, you may come to a point that you've learned all that you're going to know, and it's time for you to do, what you're going to do next. But if you're in a place where people really, care about you and care about where you're going, what your career path is, that's a great place to be. If you're learning what you need to be learning. Now, if that's not the type of work you want to do, maybe it's a different situation. But if you get with people that care and people that, want to help you get ahead, $5,000 extra is not going to do anything for you. It's just bad advice, in my opinion, that chasing management is what we should be doing, not chasing money. The money will come.
Steve, you're so spot on, because I feel like as a millennial, I'm 36, I'm living out that path. And my goal has always been to be around people who challenge me to be better. Like I tell the owner of the company that I work for all the time that you're the coach that I need, but most of the time I don't want.
Right.
And it's for that reason. There's a healthy pressure. But then number two, and this is important, this has to do with leadership, is your willingness to serve others. Because of course, everybody wants to be in a position of power. I can't tell you how many people are students that just graduate college and they're just so upset that they don't have the highest position in the office right out of college.
Right.
And I'm like, what if you change your mindset to, man, how can I serve and add value to this environment? How
can I learn? Right. How can I
learn?
How can I become what I want to be?
Exactly.
And, one thing I struggled with a little bit when, we were still just one office is, it's hard for me, knowing that my goal was to be in the corner office. And I had that kind of drive within me, is we've got several young people that have that drive within them. And there's only one corner office. How's that going to work out? Well, as you grow and as you expand, we now have 4 offices. So now there's 4 corner offices. And as we continue to geographically, kind of make our moves and do our thing and grow, that just creates all those more positions that people can kind of strive to and grow to be in. And, I think that's important too, is you can't get, and you can't have you made a good point about if the team is all one thing, it's not going to work. I made the basketball, corollary as well. When I talk to, we do our mentorship programs. I'm like, if you had 5 Michael Jordans, you're going to get beat by the quicker point guard, and the big center are going to be able to post Michael up and make that happen. You've got to have those pieces. A better example is probably if you had 11 Pat Mahomes, you're going to get sacked on every play because they can't block the giant defensive ends and nose tackles. Right. You've got to have that mix of players, that mix of skill sets. And just because somebody's skill set isn't the same as yours, you got to mesh. If somebody's the same, you're doing that. Yeah. But if they can fill your gaps, it's a much better thing.
I couldn't build out the analogy as much as you, because I'm just a musician. You're a saxophonist and a sports guy. So
I use sports analogies all the time. I feel bad for the people that I mentor that aren't sports fans, because most of my anecdotes go back to sports, but it's just an easy way to say it. It's an easy way to say, hey, this works, this doesn't. It's
absolutely,
it's a lot of the ways that it comes together, but the guys that get it, it hits home.
Yeah. So let's end on this note, because one thing that you do outside of the leadership in your work and then with the coaching of, the baseball, basketball team, is you are a musician. Mm-hmm. Why is that so important to you, and how does that impact your leadership, even in business?
It taught me confidence at a young age, to be a freshman in high school and, be in the jazz band and have a baritone sax solo on this song, to stand up in front of the band and be able to play in front of an audience. And a lot of people shy away from that. I relished that. I enjoyed it. Again, lucky Steve. My grandfather was a big band leader in the 40s. My father is a saxophone player and a saxophone repair guy. Let me tell you that anytime anything goes wrong, to get that done for free is the best thing you can ever have. But just been in the right situation. I've had access to horns and access to music my entire life. And I just enjoy being out there. It's a great way to blow off steam. Yeah. The same reason I still hit the gym at 50 is, that I can't go early in the morning because I'm not mad, and I can't go late in the afternoon because I'm tired, but I'll go at lunch, and it's just that perfect, time to go, so you're not going to have those, moments, those anger moments, or those, uncontrolled moments where you kind of lose it for a second. If you have a place to release that steam, release that outlet. And I've always found being on stage is a great way to do that. The things that I can't express through language that I can express through a saxophone. And it's a great thing to have. And I wish everybody had music as a part of their lives the way you and I did. It's such a wonderful conversational piece. And you meet so many different people. You know, I remember being in a situation where me and a couple musicians were driving in a car, and I got a business call. And, you know, I take it and it's kind of getting technical. We're talking about, you know, frictionless chillers and bearings. And, you know, I'm getting real, you know, into the BTUs and really in the nuts and bolts of it. And these guys in the car are like, the heck is going on there? And it's just odd that the people that knew me from coaching kind of thought that's who I was and didn't really realize that I had these other pieces. The same thing with music, the same thing with business. You know, when you say you're in a band, it can mean a million different things, but the people in my work circle that have come to see it have been like, oh, it's that. And I never knew you had that. I never knew, but from the very beginning, to have that presence, to have that platform, to be a soloist, to be a guy fronting a band or, you know, playing solos or doing whatever. I think it really built my confidence as a young man that, you know, really played into the leadership that I can display now.
Yeah. Music for me is the place where I go to get calm, you know, so I don't play on platforms or stages as much anymore, but I'll just go in my living room and just create melodies. Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
And then also running for me is an outlet, you know, so I encourage all of our listeners, man, you have to have some type of healthy, positive outlets. I want to emphasize the healthy outlets because we can easily pick up some vices too to try to create, but that doesn't, you know, work well in the long run. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us on the show. You offer so much value in the area of, you know, building a culture, and the area of going from ego to humility and just your vulnerability about your journey, man. I know it's going to impact and inspire a lot of our listeners. So Steve, if someone wants to reach out to you or even follow the work that you do, what's the best way to do that?
Company is called Optima Engineering. It's optimaengineering.com. You can find out about us. You can find me there. I actually have my own website too. It's stevendaley.com, Steven with a V, Daley. That's all about music. But again, it's just a whole, you know, dichotomy of things. But no, I'd love to talk to young people that are stuck or young people that are struggling a little bit. You know, I'd be happy to lend my time to try to help people get ahead. And thank you, Chris, for giving me this platform to reach some folks or hopefully, you know, inspire or help or, you know, do whatever I can. I think you're doing a great work having these leaders on and having them tell their stories and share, you know, kind of where they've been and where they're going. But yeah, I'd love to connect.
Awesome, brother. Well, man, I feel like I just sat through a masterclass in leadership. So you gave me a lot to think about. And I know you gave our listeners a lot to think about. So thank you again for tuning in to this segment of the Impactful Leader podcast. This has been just a powerful one with Steve Daley. So if you want to take him up on this offer, I encourage you to reach out to him. He sounds like an excellent coach and a leader. So thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next time.